This video is going to be slightly painful for some people to watch because I'm going to give you some facts out there. If you have been paying attention, the global debt has reached $100 trillion. And some people might not see a problem with that, but if you actually think about it, it is going to have devastating consequences on people like you, on people, the average American, on the people all across the globe. It is not going to have a significant impact on the top 1%. In fact, I will tell you more than that. The top 1% is only going to win the fact that the global debt is growing, but the average person is going to find it extremely difficult to get rich. And I'm going to show you some real numbers, some real facts on the ground, why you have to care about this debt, because the bigger this debt is going to get, the more difficult it is going to get for the average person to become rich, to become financially independent. $100 trillion is a lot of money, but most of this debt is actually owed by the governments all across the globe. So for example, you can see that Japan's debt as the ratio of GDP is 252%. But of course, most of that debt is owed by the United States, even though that the ratio is slightly smaller, or I would say half of the Japan. But the fact that the US economy is the largest economy out there makes a big portion, or 35% of all of that debt, owed by the United States. And most of that debt is actually owed by the developed countries out there, such as European Union, Singapore, the United States, Japan, and most importantly, China. China is not a developed country, of course, a developing country, but given the fact that it's the world's second largest economy, it actually can afford to borrow more money than that. So a lot of people today say that it's not really a big deal to have so much debt. Why? Because as long as we can service that debt, it shouldn't be a problem, right? If you owe, for example, I don't know, $1 million, but the interest that you have to pay on that $1 million, for example, is $50,000 annually, and you make what, $300,000, and you can pay that $50,000 every single year. So it's not really a big deal. And that's how people often think. But you have to understand that we have never had, probably in the entire history of humanity, as much debt as we have today. And this is the debt that I told you is just the debt that the governments owe. And if you even take that debt and put it on the other side with the global GDP, which is $100 trillion, you will realize that the global debt right now is as much as the global GDP. And if you don't find that really a problem, let me give you another statistics. If you include all of the debt that exists right now in the world, it's way more than $100 trillion. It's $315 trillion. So the global GDP is $100 trillion. The global debt is $315 trillion. Because at the end of the day, you have to understand that it's not just the government that is borrowing money. I mean, take a look at your life. You probably have like a credit card debt, auto loan to finance that car. You probably have a mortgage in order to have a roof over your head. So if we kind of got all of that debt together and put them on one side, we will have an entire global debt of $315 trillion. And now, in order to kind of worse off this situation, guess how much wealth is there in the world? Now, according to UBS, the global wealth across the globe is $450 trillion. Now I want you to take a look at these two numbers, and I want you to find a problem right here. Take a look at this number and this number. As if most of the wealth in the United States, not in the United States, but across the globe, is literally just debt. If it wasn't for this $315 trillion, we wouldn't have $450 trillion worth of debt. And the problem with wealth is that wealth doesn't just randomly grow if you don't actually put effort into growing it. Yeah, to a certain extent, it can passively grow when you have, like, for example, a house that brings you a certain level of passive income, even though that it also requires some level of management. But most of the wealth does not. So if most of that wealth is financed by debt, and debt has an interest that grows over time, what do you think is going to happen to the economy in the long run? And this is just, I'm going to tell you by the end of the video, I'm going to show you some numbers within the video, and you will be actually amazed how bad the situation is. As of the time I'm recording this video, the US national debt grows by $1 trillion every 100 days. Imagine for a moment that the debt grows by $1 trillion, or $3.5 trillion every single year, simply because it has an interest on it. Not just an interest, because it's like a debt cycle. So you have borrowed so much money and now you can't really make the payments. So the government literally borrows more money in order to pay its old debt. And that's kind of a cycle it grows. And that's why what the government essentially doing at the end of the day is that it's just buying time for itself. Because if you kind of take a look at the numbers right now, you will realize that the US government pays around $1 trillion just in interest. It's not really exactly trillions, it's probably like $900 billion, but it's very close. And that's why if you take a look at the forecast of the national debt by the United States, it's expected to grow to $54 trillion in the next 10 years. And this is a very conservative estimate, because if you take the estimate that it grows by $1 trillion every 100 days, then it's supposed to be at least $60 trillion, or probably even like $65 trillion. And that's how bad the situation is. And now let's get the problem. The problem is that because all of that debt is thrown into the economy, it creates something that some economists call out there the everything bubble. And that means that we have thrown so much money into the economy that we have inflated the prices of everything that it just became unaffordable for most people. Now, in order for you to understand why is that a problem, since we have something that we call fiat money or paper money, and that money can actually be created. So that money, even though that it's a medium of exchange, it's supposed to act in the economy as if any other commodity out there. So for example, here is how money actually works. You have, let's say, 10 houses within the economy, and let's say, just hypothetical example, that we have like $10 within the economy. So within this hypothetical economy, one house is going to equal to $1, because within the entire economy, there are $10 and 10 houses. Now, if we actually change this equation and we throw an extra $10 into the economy, where we have now $20, but still we have the exact same 10 houses, the prices of these 10 houses are going to be inflated to $2, so that a number of money that exists within the economy will equal to the number of houses. Of course, it works slightly more complicated, because within the entire economy, we don't just have houses, we have cars, we have different kind of products, we have technology, we have services, but that's in essence how it works. So if we actually borrow $315 trillion and we threw it into the economy, what do you think has happened to the asset prices, houses, stocks, and everything else? They are inflated to the point where they don't really worth that much. The reason they are so expensive simply because we have actually thrown so much money into the economy. So this is basically a simple diagram in order to show you what happens. So on one side, for example, we have the banks. The banks are creating money out of thin air, not out of thin air, they're literally just creating debt, for example. And this debt is actually given to who? To people, to investors. These investors, such as hedge funds or any kind of other investors, take that money and they start buying assets. What do you think is going to happen to the prices of these assets? They are going to rise. Why? Because the demand for them has increased, and the money came from the banks, and the bank created money out of thin air by creating debt, for example. And it's just one of the ways that prices are being inflated. The other way is that the bank gives a lot of debt to companies. I mean, for example, just go back to 2020 when the Fed lowered the rates to almost 0%. What do you think has happened during that time? You would see literally every other company that could actually have access to money, to loans, they have borrowed money and they started investing in one way or another. And I remember back in the days, like in 2020, there was a company called Nikola, and the CEO of that company was trying to challenge Elon Musk and would create electrical cars and would somehow compete. It was all one giant scam out there. But the point is that they took loans and they actually started buying assets. So within this system that we have over here, we created, you can say, we have created $315 trillion, and we have inflated the prices of all of the assets that they have grown to the point where these prices are unsustainable. Let's just take an example of the S&P 500. So if you take a look at the S&P 500 for the last, like, let's say 80 or for the last like 50 years or something like that, you will realize that up until 2008, for example, it wasn't really growing that much. And after the crash of the 2008, it has probably fallen from like 1,700 to something like around 1,000. That was a catastrophic collapse for the S&P 500 right around here. But do you think what happens after that? It grows dramatically to almost 6,000. That is the biggest growth that has happened over there. And a lot of people indicate to the fact that this growth was fueled by a lot of debt. This is not because the productivity has increased. This is not because the output has increased. This is simply because this was the point where we have discovered something that we call quantitative easing. Now, quantitative easing is simply a very fancy word to say that we have printed money, but we don't want to call it printing money, but we're going to just call it quantitative easing. Another diagram that would actually explain why the prices are overinflated in the S&P 500, for example, is simply if we take a look at the average PE ratio. Now, a PE ratio, in very simple words, you can call it that, how much investors are willing to overpay for the profits that the company is going to make. How many years it will take for investors to make their money back. So if the PE ratio, for example, is 15, then by buying or investing $1 in this company, it's going to take you, for example, 15 years to make that money back. It's a very simple terminology in order to explain what the PE ratio without actually getting into the details. And if you actually go back, for instance, to the 1980s, the average PE ratio was something between like around 10. It was slightly lower than that, probably 7 or 8, but nonetheless, it was around 10. And as you can see that it started growing dramatically. And one of the biggest rises was, of course, during this period. This was the period where we had something that we call the dot-com bubble. When internet companies out there came out, they wouldn't really make a lot of money, but investors were willing to buy those stocks, hoping that in the future they will make so much money that they will regain back their investments. But at the end of the day, the bubble burst, and most of these companies, if I'm not mistaken, probably like 99% of those companies went bankrupt. And even the most successful company that came out of the dot-com bubble was Amazon. And its share plummeted by probably over 95%, if I'm not mistaken. You can literally just Google the numbers and you'll find it out. And that's why the PE ratios increased dramatically. But then they came back again. Of course, the PE ratios during the 2008 financial crisis also surged dramatically. But as you can see that the trend is very upward. It went from an average of 10 of PE ratio to an average of 30. And why exactly did that happen over the last 50 years? And that's because investors are more than willing to overpay for these investments. And where that money is coming from? That money is created by debt. That is pure debt created out of thin air and thrown into the economy. And that is why you can see that the S&P 500 has grown substantially over the last 15 or 20 years. Now, not literally 20 years, because that inflation of prices actually dramatically started to be noticed in the market after the 2008 financial crisis. And now let me tell you what does that means for the average person. The average person is getting poorer. And the reason for that is that if you actually take a look at the wages and you compare them to the productivity, you will realize that the average productivity of the average American has increased, for example, since World War II. That is a very normal thing that actually happens. But the real wages since 1973 has been stagnating. What exactly does that mean? That means that people are working more, people are producing more, people are actually creating more output out there, but their wages aren't really increasing. Or let me just paraphrase it to make it more, understandable for the average person. Because there is so much money coming into the economy because of that, house prices, which is a sector of assets, are rising, but your wages aren't really rising because investors and banks and companies take all that money and they start buying assets while your wages stay the same, which means that you're simply getting poorer. And now let me tell you, why is this a big problem for the average person who is working 9 to 5 or have any kind of a job? Now, if you just take a look at the median income back in 1973, it was $12,000. And if you take a look at the median house price, it was around $33,000. So the average person, even though that he used to make significantly less than he used to make right now, because the median income right now in the United States is $59,000. Well, that is way more than $12,000. But if you just go back to 1973, the average home price was $33,000. Hypothetically, anyone would save like 3 years worth of his income, he would probably get a house. Now, of course, this is just a hypothetical scenario because you have to include houses. And also a lot of people need a roof to rent a place, for example, at least until they can afford the house. They need to put food on the table and they have different kind of expenses. But the general idea is that the average house price was 3 times your average income, which is absolutely normal. And you might think that as time goes by, as the productivity grows, as people work harder, people work longer, yes, house prices have increased, but maybe incomes should increase as much as house prices, for example. But if we come back to 2024, for example, and you take a look at the numbers, the median income is $59,000, but the median house price is $424,000. It's no longer like 3 times, because if it was the exact same ratio, then the median house price should be less than $200,000. But if you actually compare now 59 to 424,000, it's around 7 times. In other words, house prices grew twice more faster, even more than that, since 1973. And that's because we have a lot of money coming in from the banks. Rich people take this money and they start buying assets. Asset prices start being inflated to the point, but wages don't really grow that much. And some people might not realize how poor they have got over the last 50 years simply because we have something called technology. And technology had actually made our lives significantly better. Technology allowed us to do stuff that we couldn't actually even dream about 50 years ago. And that's why people might feel like people back in 1970s were poorer. But in reality, people used to make a lot more money. The wages in numbers were smaller back in 1970, but the purchasing power of those wages were significantly stronger than they are today in 2024. And that takes me to an absolutely different point. When will this bubble actually burst? Because if all those rich people, if those banks created so much debt and they started buying all of those assets and now prices are inflated, so it has turned into that we call the everything bubble, it must burst, right? Well, the problem is that it's not really as simple as you think. This bubble might not actually burst, and let me explain why. Now, if you take a look at the society, you will realize that we have rich people and we have poor people. Now, it's not because, some people might point to the fact that it's not exactly like that because it's like a spectrum and some people closer to being rich and others closer to being poor, and we have middle class. But in reality, if you actually take a look at it, there are 2 main ways to make money within the economy. The first most important way is when you have a paycheck, when you have a specific income. You get a job and you're actually paid a specific paycheck every single month, for example. Now, the second way for you to actually make money is when you have an asset and the value of that asset actually rises. Now, what do you think happens when the money or the banks create so much debt and throw it into the economy and the prices of those assets starts rising? Or rich people who actually make their money through something that we call capital gain, they make dramatically more money. Their wealth starts rising. They make more money simply because there is more debt has been created within the economy. And what do you think is happening to everybody who actually makes his money with a paycheck? Their wealth goes down because their paycheck don't grow as much as, for example, the assets that are there in the market or the economy overall, and at the same time, their wages are actually growing slower than those assets, and those assets are growing faster than their income, which means that they're simply getting poorer. And now, the second problem is that if you take a look at the government and at the revenue that the government is actually making, because we have so much debt that is issued by the government and the government must pay a portion or at least the interest on that debt in order to sustain that debt, where do you think the government is going to take that money from? Now, this is the revenue of the government, for example, for the past year or for 2022. And you will realize that this is individual income taxes and this is payroll taxes. And these two types of taxes or revenue sources for the government represent around 85%, probably 90% of the entire revenue of the government. Income tax is the tax that you pay because you have a job. A payroll tax is also something very similar to that, but it's split between you and your employer. But your employer, before it actually offers you something like that, they make the calculation that most of that tax actually lies on you. So when you have like your salary that they tell you when they actually hire you, they basically include that payroll tax in order to make sure that that tax is paid by you. So the government is going to take a big portion of your income in order to pay the interest to sustain that debt, which means that the economy will go slower while a lot of debt will be created and thrown into the economy, including by the government and other financial institutions, inflating asset prices, making rich people richer. In other words, the wealth inequality will keep growing. And even if you take a look at the numbers, I don't really have the chart right in front of me right now, but if you take a look at the wealth inequality, this is exactly why wealth inequality in the United States and most of other countries across the globe has been rising dramatically. And because we have this situation right now that is not easily solved by any government across the globe, the wealth inequality is only going to rise. Now, the main question of the video is that how do you go from this side to this side? How do you protect yourself? Now, the answer is very simple and straightforward. You have to change the way you make your money. If you're making your income, for example, from just a paycheck, then over the long run, you'll just keep getting poorer. So instead of doing this, you have to do what rich people are doing. You have to start buying assets that whose prices are going to rise as they will be throwing more money into the economy, which will actually keep happening like it has happened since 1970s when Nixon abandoned the gold standard. Now, of course, you have a lot of choices to start buying assets. The most popular choice is real estate, but real estate is expensive. Like you want to buy real estate, costs $200,000, $300,000, $500,000, and that's not something that people can. So the best option for most people is to start with the stock market, because if you understand which stocks to buy, if you understand how to analyze companies, if you understand how to invest properly in the stock market, you can buy the right stocks that will actually cost you a small amount of money. But if you actually invest in the right stocks in the long run, they will actually rise substantially more than any real estate possibly can. And that's how you actually protect yourself and take advantage out of the everything bubble. Otherwise, you will just see your wages stagnate while asset prices keep rising and the wealth inequality will just keep rising. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.